Howdy folks, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. It's not going to be a mammoth episode like last week, which ran on for nearly an hour, although there were a couple of things that I wanted to talk about last week, which I didn't really have time to squeeze in, because the episode was already running on for nearly an hour. But the first thing that I wanted to talk about this week was the aircraft carrier rebalance on the World of Warships test server, because there's a new test server up, and there's all kinds of things that have changed. The basic concept remains exactly the same, and what they've done with this second round on the test server is pretty much as I was hoping they were going to do. They've tweaked a bunch of the numbers, specifically with regards to anti-aircraft defense. Previously I thought anti-aircraft gameplay was just far too weak. This time around I think it may even be a little too strong. The thing is, it's very hard to judge because of the fact that it's happening on the test server, and it's specifically set up to test aircraft carrier gameplay and aircraft carrier counter gameplay, which means that everybody's either playing an aircraft carrier or they're playing something that's specifically been set up to shoot down aircraft, whether that be an AA cruiser or a battleship like the Montana, for example, with a full anti-air build. You see, that's the thing on the test server at the moment. Everybody is playing things that are specifically set up and heavily skewed in favour of shooting down lots and lots and lots of aircraft. They're not necessarily practical builds to put on, for example, your Montana or your Grosser Kurfürst or your Yamato on the live server, because, yeah, you'll be good at shooting down aircraft, but you won't be a whole lot of good at pretty much anything else. So, bearing that in mind, it's kind of difficult to judge whether or not they've gone a little bit too far in the other direction as far as anti-aircraft firepower is concerned on the test server. If anything, I think if they're going to lean too far in any one direction, it should be in favour of anti-aircraft firepower, and I'll tell you why. Actually, the reason is fairly simple. Carriers don't run out of aircraft, in exactly the same way that a cruiser, destroyer or battleship in World of Warships doesn't run out of ammunition for its guns. The new aircraft carriers are not going to run out of aircraft. You can still get them shot down, as I am proving quite successfully here as I attempt to execute a rocket attack here. Admittedly, it's against the Seattle, and it is probably full AA build, but what I'm trying to do here is use the rockets to knock out anti-aircraft guns, to soften the target up for succeeding waves of attack aircraft, whether they be dive bombers or torpedo bombers. And that's basically why I'm quite happy if anti-aircraft firepower is a little too strong at the moment, because I can never run out of aircraft. You see, the attacks delivered by my aircraft can never get any weaker, but the defences of the ships that I'm attacking with my aircraft can only get weaker. As the battle goes on, they're losing anti-aircraft mounts to rockets, bombs and torpedoes. They're using up their defensive fire consumable, for example. So the longer the battle goes on, the more powerful the carrier is getting and the weaker the defences of the ships that you have to attack. So I was kind of concerned that that may actually lead to carriers being just a little bit too overpowered, regardless of how they tweak the anti-aircraft firepower numbers. And in my mind at least, it was a fairly serious case for the argument that aircraft should be limited and it should be possible to lose all of your aircraft. However, bearing this in mind, I set up a training room with a Tier 8 Japanese carrier, the Shikaku, fighting the Tier 10 American cruiser, the Worcester. I know that's not exactly balanced in favour of the Shikaku, but I just wanted to see exactly what sort of numbers would come up. And I specifically attempted to strip as many anti-aircraft guns from the Worcester as I possibly could, using waves and waves and waves of rocket attack planes. At the end of the battle, I had managed to knock out the grand total of 4 of the Worcester's anti-aircraft gun mounts. Now, if you have a look at how many anti-aircraft gun emplacements the USS Worcester has, yeah, that's nothing. 4 guns is nothing. It's no appreciable difference whatsoever to the anti-aircraft firepower output of the USS Worcester. That doesn't mean, of course, that you're not going to get your AA guns blown up by high explosive shells fired by other warships. That is, in fact, probably going to be the primary source of a ship getting stripped of its anti-aircraft firepower. It's definitely not going to be the aircraft carriers doing it. At least, not with the numbers as they currently stand on the test server. So while I'm still not 100% convinced that it's a great idea to have aircraft carriers in the upcoming rebalance, effectively having an unlimited amount of aircraft to throw into the battle, with the way the anti-aircraft firepower is currently working, I can kind of see that it might not be a completely stupid idea. Also, it's important that you realise they only effectively have unlimited aircraft. You see, the way it works is you've got three different types of squadrons. Attack planes that fire rockets, dive bombers and torpedo bombers. And if you throw a squadron straight into the teeth of the enemy anti-aircraft defences and get them all shot down straight away, that type of aircraft, whether it be attack planes, dive bombers or torpedo bombers, has to regenerate back on the flight deck of your carrier. And if you've gotten them shot down very quickly, a full squadron isn't going to be ready. Now, you can launch whatever you have, but it's not going to be a full squadron. You will, on the other hand, have, for example, if you've just gotten all of your attack planes shot down, you will have a full squadron of dive bombers and torpedo bombers waiting to go. But if you're absolutely definitely determined to take off again with your attack aircraft, you're just going to have to go with whatever is ready on the flight deck. It's not going to be a full squadron. Now, this isn't to say that I think everything is absolutely fine and dandy in the aircraft carrier rebalance world. There are a couple of decisions that Wargaming have taken that I think are highly questionable, and I'm talking mainly about two things here. First, the way consumables work on your carrier, and I'm specifically talking about the carrier itself here, not the consumables that you have in your aircraft. No, here I'm talking about carrier consumables like damage control and anti-aircraft fire. Now, on anything that isn't an aircraft carrier, it's up to you to decide when to use those consumables. That's not the case with the carriers. The consumables on the carriers are automatic. So what that means is you come under attack from the enemy carrier, for example, and they lead the attack with a bunch of rocket planes. Your anti-aircraft defences automatically trigger as soon as the enemy aircraft get within range. The rocket planes hit you and set a fire. Now, a fire on a carrier only lasts 5 seconds, so it's going to do next to no damage. But right after the damage control goes off, because remember, you've got no control over it, it's automatic, and extinguishes a fire that was only going to burn for 5 seconds in the first place, you eat a bunch of torpedoes fired by an enemy destroyer. And there's nothing you can do about the flooding. Now, okay, the flooding is only going to last, I believe, 30 seconds. But I don't know about you, I'd rather take a couple of hundred damage from a fire that's only going to take 5 seconds over a couple of thousand damage from a flood that's going to last 30 seconds. And of course, now that your aircraft defences have been triggered by the rocket planes that were only ever going to do a little bit of damage, and if they were lucky, set a fire that's only going to last 30 seconds, the enemy carrier now knows exactly where you are. He follows up his rocket plane attack with torpedo bombers of his own. Your anti-aircraft defences are now on cooldown after triggering on the attack planes that hardly did any damage whatsoever. And your damage control is now on cooldown because it just put out a fire that was only ever going to last 5 seconds. And so your torpedo bombers get through, you take multiple torpedo hits, and you flood. So that's kind of stupid. And the simple reason for this, the simple reason why aircraft carriers are going to have automatic consumables rather than leaving it up to you to decide when to use those consumables, exactly the same way you do in every other ship that is in an aircraft carrier. The simple reason for that is because Wargaming thinks we're all too stupid. No, really, Wargaming thinks we're all too stupid to be able to concentrate on more than one thing at the same time. Now, while I am sitting here laughing about that, they might actually have a point. There are probably a lot of World of Warships players out there who are too stupid to be able to concentrate on more than one thing at the same time. But that doesn't mean we all are. It'd be nice to at least have the choice. Anyway, I did say there were two things that I wasn't entirely happy about with the current state of the aircraft carrier rebalance. That's one. The other thing, I think, is far more serious. You see, it's currently possible for you to pick the radio position finding skill for the captain of your aircraft carrier. And what's beyond stupid, at least in my opinion, is the fact that the radio position finding skill also works on your aircraft. Anything launched by the carrier also picks up the skill. For those of you who don't know what RPF is, radio position finding, it's a skill which gives you an indicator on screen from whichever unit you happen to be controlling that points in the direction of the closest enemy ship. Now if you're sitting there thinking, well, ships can have it, why can't aircraft? Now, when they introduced the RPF skill in the first place, way back when, I thought it was a terrible idea. For those specific circumstances, when, for example, you're in a destroyer, you've carried your team's arse off, but despite your best efforts, you're ahead on points, but you're now the last surviving ship on the team, and your only prayer of winning the game is to stay hidden and wait to win on points. Now, if one of the ships on the enemy team has that RPF skill, they're not going to know exactly where you are, but they're going to know which way to go in order to find you. And at the time when RPF was introduced, I foresaw this being a bit of a problem. As it happens, it didn't break the game after all, and it did in fact become a very useful tool for people in destroyers, cruisers and battleships. But the reason it didn't break the game is because ships, cruisers, destroyers and battleships can't zoom around the map at 300 knots looking for the last couple of enemy ships alive in order to sink them and secure the win. Aircraft can. So if you are the last surviving ship on a team that's currently ahead on points and the enemy team still has an aircraft carrier and the captain of that aircraft carrier has the RPF skill, you are fucked. You can't hide from that. There's absolutely nothing that you can do. Now, it could be that I'm wrong, it could be that I'm overreacting. I mean, I predicted that RPF was going to spell the end of destroyer gameplay. It never did. It just changed the meta slightly. It may be that this is just a case of more of the same. I guess we'll see. All I know is I don't have a particularly good feeling about that. On the whole, however, a couple of exceptions aside, I do think that the aircraft carrier rebalance is moving in the right direction. It's certainly way better in this second public test iteration than it was in the first version of the public test when the aircraft themselves were just way too powerful. Now, whether or not it's ready to go live in 10 days or whenever the next patch is, that's a different question. And of course, whether or not you're actually going to enjoy the new aircraft carrier gameplay, or whether you're going to enjoy going up against the new aircraft carrier gameplay and your cruisers, destroyers and battleships, that's an entirely different question, and only you can answer that one. But it's coming soon, and it's probably not going to change too much from what we have currently seen. Moving on to a couple of questions. Kubazet99CZ said, Dear Jingles, do you think ex-World of Tanks players make World of Warships toxic? During your and Quickie Baby's videos about the declining rate of World of Tanks, something occurred to me how this affected the World of Warships community. As we all know, the probability of special and toxic teammates is considerably high. Thing is, it wasn't the case that long ago. Back during the first year of World of Warships, I can count on the fingers of one hand all of the incidents of toxic teammates. Everyone seemed nice back then. Almost no one would scream at you in chat and so on. During the second year of World of Warships, it wasn't so bad as today, but during that it started to shift towards who we have now. I think the largest shift arrived during fall and winter of 2017. And that's pretty on spot when the largest drop of World of Tanks players happened. He goes on talking about numbers and statistics and so on and so on, but the general question, do you think ex-World of Tanks players migrating from World of Tanks to World of Warships is making World of Warships more toxic? Okay, I've got two answers to your question. There's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is no, I don't think that's true. Now for the long answer, and if I can just address one of your points in slightly more detail. You mentioned that the fall and winter of 2017 was when you started to personally notice a larger amount of toxic players in World of Warships. This was actually the time where the World of Tanks player base started to recover from a decline and actually started growing, Christmas 2017. So if you've noticed a higher than average amount of toxicity from the player community in World of Tanks at that time, it's almost certainly not because of a sudden influx of World of Tanks players, because World of Tanks numbers were actually going up at that time. Now, something else that's been going up steadily since launch, at least on the EU server, are the amount of people playing World of Warships. And I'm fairly convinced that if you have noticed an increase in toxicity over the years, and I am inclined overall to agree with you. I think we do have a more toxic player base in World of Warships now than we did 1 or 2 years ago, but I don't think it's due to any sudden influx of World of Tanks players. I think it's simply down to the fact that World of Warships, again, on the EU server at least, is more popular than it was 1 year or 2 years ago. And this is good, of course, because it means the developers can continue developing the game and feeding their families at the same time. But this is just a natural consequence of a game becoming more popular. I don't think it's got anything to do with a sudden influx of World of Tanks players. This is just what happens when a game becomes more popular. You see, when World of Warships started, when it was in open beta, and shortly after it went into release, I'm fairly sure that most of the people playing the game were playing it because it was warships. They loved warships, and they loved playing a game about warships. 3 years down the line, we still have a lot of people playing because they love warships who are still very enthusiastic and passionate about the game. But in the meantime, World of Warships have been running some very successful and award-winning adverts for the game, which have been bringing in new players. We've had the Steam release, which has brought in a lot of new players. New players who aren't necessarily, well, interested or invested in the fact that it's warships. They're just browsing the Steam free-to-play release charts every month and looking for the latest game they can play that isn't going to cost them any money. They're not necessarily going to get excited when, for example, Wargaming announced that they're introducing HMS Exeter in the way that you or I might get excited at the news that Wargaming are releasing HMS Exeter. They are, by the way. They wouldn't know what HMS Exeter was and probably wouldn't care even if you explained it to them. They're just here for the free-to-play. And that's fine. But you get a lot of players like that who aren't quite as passionate about the game as you or I might be. And they tend to be on the toxic side. Let's just put it that way. This, unfortunately, is just a natural consequence of what happens when a game gets more and more popular and starts attracting players outside of that core market, you know, the ship enthusiasts who were there first and were playing the game from the very beginning. Now, of course, it's not out of the question that a lot of these newer players are going to become warship enthusiasts as a result of being exposed to warships from playing the game. In fact, that's what happened to me with World of Tanks. I wasn't really, you know, that enthusiastic about tanks until I started playing World of Tanks and got interested in tanks and started reading up on and watching movies and documentaries about tanks. That can definitely be a thing. In fact, I suspect there are probably a lot of you watching this video right now, or just listening to it while driving your car to work or whatever, on your mobile phone, who didn't really care an awful lot about ships until you started playing World of Warships and basically became a ship nerd as a result of your exposure to World of Warships. That's certainly possible, and almost certainly true. But I think it's also possible and true that there are still a lot of people out there who started playing the game as a result of adverts that they saw on Facebook or on YouTube, or who simply started playing because they saw it in the free-to-play release schedule on Steam, and they don't really care that much about the subject matter. And when you don't care that much about the subject matter, when you're not invested in it, when you're not passionate about the subject, all you're really there for is the gameplay. And the teammates can sometimes really ruin that gameplay. And then we see a rise in the levels of toxicity. I mean, way back when Elite Dangerous was in, I think it was the closed or possibly the open beta, whenever we were first allowed to do videos on it, I did a couple of Elite Dangerous videos. And I was checking out the Elite Dangerous forums to see what sort of response my videos had gained from the veterans, the guys that had been there since the closed alpha. And generally speaking, most people seemed to be quite happy with the idea that I was doing Elite Dangerous videos, because, let's face it, I've got a couple of 100,000 subscribers, and they were quite keen on the idea of the game that they loved, because they were passionate about Elite. A lot of them had played the original Elite way back in the 80s, or they played the sequels in the 90s, and they were very excited and happy that a game that they loved and were passionate about was being opened up to a wider audience, while at the same time concerned about the kind of players that my videos promoting the game were likely to be bringing in. because they understood that as a game gets more popular, the kind of people playing it, well, they're not just there because they're passionate about the subject matter. So the long answer to your question is no, I don't think a sudden influx of World of Tanks players, people who are sick and tired of World of Tanks and have moved over to World of Warships, is responsible for any increase in the levels of toxicity that you may be experiencing while playing World of Warships. I think all you're actually seeing here is the natural consequence of a game as it becomes more popular, as World of Warships undeniably is. And it's pulling in a larger audience, beyond those who get excited at playing the Warspite just because it's the Warspite. Instead, you've got a larger number of players who have no idea what the Warspite is, haven't got a clue about its historical significance. They're only here because the game's free to play and they're no more invested in World of Warships than they are in World of Tanks, League of Legends, or any other free-to-play game. And while we're here, you know, I think it's important that we keep this in perspective. I mean, you say you've experienced an increase in the level of toxicity when playing World of Warships. Well, I'm inclined to agree with you, but at the same time, it's still not bad, is it? I mean, let's just compare it to, for example, World of Tanks or League of Legends. Look at the average levels of toxicity you experience when you're playing World of Tanks and League of Legends, and then look at the number of people playing World of Tanks and League of Legends, and I think we can see a direct correlation here between the level of toxicity of the community and the amount of people playing. You can blame World of Tanks for a lot of things, but I don't honestly think an increase in toxicity levels in the World of Warships community is one of them. Well, before we go, there are a couple of things that I meant to mention in last week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, but just kind of started running out of time. And the first thing is something that I actually should have mentioned when I did my World of Warships Legends video, all those weeks or possibly even months ago. But I completely forgot at the time because I'm kind of crap, and it's actually fairly important. For those of you who don't know what World of Warships Legends is, it's the console version of World of Warships, and I did a preview video on it in advance of the beta weekend that they did late last year. And the important news that I forgot to mention in my original preview video was actually fairly significant. See, a lot of you were kind of concerned that the tech trees in World of Warships Legends only went up to tier 7 and had been compressed, skipping out a bunch of ships. But one of the things about that tier 1 to tier 7 tech tree that they have in the console version that's kind of important is due to the matchmaker. You see, in World of Warships Legends, unlike in World of Warships on PC, the matchmaker is only one tier in each direction. So if you're in a tier 5, you'll only ever have to fight tier 6s, not tier 7s, and so on and so on. So that's a fairly important omission that I really should have mentioned at the time when I did my World of Warships Legends video. So, well, sorry about that. But it was the sort of thing that at some point I was going to have to mention just to correct the record. Anyway, the other thing that I wanted to talk about this week before we finish this episode of Mingles with Jingles has got absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with games. Now, this is going to sound kind of bizarre, but trust me, stay with me. I hate flies. I think they're the most annoying insect in the world, and I kill them at any given opportunity. I absolutely despised the little buggers when I was a kid growing up in Newcastle in the northeast of England. And then when I was 12 in 1982, we emigrated to South Africa. And then I was 13 in 1983, we moved to Swaziland. And let me tell you, there are a lot of flies in Africa. I killed tens of thousands of the little buggers, and I got to be very, very good at it. My hand-eye coordination was great. I was the fly nemesis. Well, the years went by. I moved back to England, joined the Navy, went to all kinds of places where it was very hot and there were lots and lots of flies, and I killed tens of thousands more. But as the years went on, my hand-eye coordination started to suffer, and these days I am a pretty crap fly killer. What's this got to do with anything, Jingles? Well, good question. I'm glad you asked. Like I said, stay with me. All will become clear. I recently started reading a book on my Kindle. It's called Science-ish, The Peculiar Science Behind the Movies. It's not bad. In fact, it's pretty good. And it talks about all kinds of things that you see in science fiction movies and asks the question, is any of this kind of stuff really possible, like the wormholes and the black holes in Interstellar, like the time travel in any number of time travel movies, Back to the Future being a perfect example, and like the bullet time that you see in The Matrix, when Neo slows time down and basically dodges bullets. What's that got to do with flies, Jingles? Hang on a second, we're going to get there. But first, we have to talk about the nature of perception. And what we're talking about here is how your brain basically tells you lies all the time. You see, what you perceive as reality, what we all perceive as reality, is a result of how your brain interprets, processes, receives, and amalgamates a whole bunch of sensory inputs, not all of which may actually be arriving at your brain at the same time, in order to kind of mesh all of those inputs together in a way that you are going to interpret as what is happening right now. Let me give you an example. Let us say you are just casually strolling along the street one day and you see a football lying there on the pavement. You think to yourself, I'm going to kick that football. But what you don't know, and what you're about to find out, is that some funny bugger has filled this football with concrete. And so when you kick that football, a whole bunch of things are all going to happen at the same time. First, you're going to break your toes. However, because the nerves that are sending that, oh shit, that hurt sensation to your brain are located as far away from your brain as it's possible for them to be, it's going to take that nerve impulse just a little bit longer to make it to your brain than the sound of your toes breaking. And your eyes telling your brain, because they're right next to your brain, that that football didn't move an inch. And so what your brain has to do under these circumstances is take all of these different sensory inputs, which are not necessarily arriving at the brain at the same time. And it has to take them, put them together in a way that you experience as something that all happened at the same time. And so what your brain is actually doing to you is presenting you with a reality that, in actual fact, because of the length of time it takes the pain signals from your toes to reach your brain, may have actually occurred a tenth of a second in the past. You're not actually experiencing reality. You're experiencing your brain's version of reality because of the way your nerves work. Well, that's all very interesting, Jingles, but what does it have to do with flies? Hang on a second, bear with me. The book then went into some detail talking about what happens to people who have experienced life or death situations and have said that it seemed as if time slowed down, almost as if they were watching everything in slow motion. Now what they're talking about here is the number of times per second your brain takes a snapshot of reality in order to process what's going on around you in a way that you can understand. And the simplest way to explain this is to look at slow motion photography. If something's being filmed at 24 frames per second and then projected onto a screen at 24 frames per second, your brain fills in the gaps and what you see looks perfectly real and natural. However, if you were to film it at 48 frames per second and then play it back at 24 frames per second, it would appear that everything was moving at half speed. That's the basic principle of slow motion photography. Now, a bunch of very clever people have gotten together in the past and conducted experiments on people by subjecting them to very high stress situations and then monitoring them and trying to decide whether or not this sense of time slowing down in high stress situations was a result of the brain suddenly upping its sampling rate to, for example, 48 frames per second rather than 24 frames per second, or whether it was just a case of perceptions. Because if the brain was suddenly increasing the rate in a high stress situation at which it took samples of what was going on around it, then you would be able to react significantly faster than you would in reality. In the same way that Neo, for example, is able to slow time down in the Matrix and dodge bullets. It turned out this wasn't actually the case. The brain is still effectively, for the sake of argument, taking a snapshot at 24 frames per second in the same way as normal photography. It was just that the perception of the people involved in the experiments was slowing down the rate at which they interpreted. So they could see it coming, but they couldn't do a thing about it, which is probably actually worse. So, what's this got to do with flies, Jingles? Here's the thing. Apparently, it's been determined that if we, for example, for the sake of argument, and nobody really knows the exact rate, but let's say we sample our reality at a rate of 24 frames per second, flies sample their reality at a rate that's measured in the hundreds of frames per second. So flies, in effect, are operating in bullet time all the time. So the next time you roll up a newspaper and try to swat that fly that's been pissing you off for the last 10 minutes and it effortlessly dodges the newspaper, it's not that you're just old and crap. Like me. It's because that bloody fly is Neo. And as far as the fly's concerned, that newspaper is coming towards it in slow motion. Like I said, flies are utter bastards, and this is the reason why. And on that bombshell, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.